You remember what eggs cost 3 years ago, not because you were paying special attention, not because you were tracking inflation. You remember because the gap between then and now has become unavoidable. Every receipt is a small confrontation with arithmetic that doesn't add up the way you were told it would. Inflation is slowing, they say. The worst is behind us. The numbers confirm it. Annual increases have dropped from 9% to 3%, sometimes less. Relief is here. Except your grocery bill hasn't gotten the message. It hasn't retreated. It hasn't even paused to catch its breath. It just stays there, at the new altitude, like it was always meant to be this high. You're not imagining this. The confusion you're feeling isn't because you don't understand economics. It's because the word inflation is doing two different jobs, and we only ever talk about one of them. When economists say inflation is falling, they mean prices are rising more slowly, not falling, not reversing, just rising at a gentler angle. The mountain is still getting taller, we're just adding inches now instead of feet. But your bank account doesn't experience rates of change, it experiences the price, the absolute number on the shelf, and that number remembers every surge, every shock, every quarter where costs climbed and never came back down. Prices have a strange kind of memory. They recall the pain of rising much more vividly than they recall the obligation to fall. This isn't just something that happened to you, it's happening now, in real time. Children growing up today will have no memory of cheaper eggs, cheaper rent, cheaper basics. This will be their normal. And 20 years from now, when the next shock comes and prices reset higher again, they'll feel the same confusion you're feeling now, the same sense that something is off, the same gap between the official narrative and lived reality. And that's the part that matters, because this pattern didn't begin with this inflation cycle, or this decade, or even this century. This isn't new. After World War I, food prices in Europe doubled, sometimes tripled. Wheat, milk, butter, everything that kept people alive became unaffordable. Governments promised it was temporary. Wartime disruption, they said. Supply chains will heal, farmers will recover. And they did recover. Harvests returned, supply chains mended, the war ended. Prices stayed high. Not all of them, not forever, but they stayed high long enough that a generation grew up never knowing what bread cost before the war. The crisis passed, the prices didn't. They reset the baseline, and societies learned to live at the new altitude without calling it a crisis anymore. That's the trick. Once the emergency ends and the number just stays, it stops being news, it becomes normal. You might be thinking, surely it's different now. We have central banks, we have supply chain logistics, we have technology. And you'd be right that the mechanisms have changed, but the pattern hasn't, because the pattern isn't about supply and demand in the textbook sense. It's about something deeper. Prices don't just reflect cost, they reflect memory. When input costs rise, fuel, labor, packaging, transportation, companies raise prices immediately. They have to. Margins get squeezed, survival instinct kicks in. But when those input costs fall, something peculiar happens. Prices don't fall at the same speed, sometimes they don't fall at all. And it's not because of greed, not in the way we usually mean it. It's because companies remember the volatility. They remember how fast things can swing the other way, so they hold the higher price as a buffer, a cushion, insurance against the next shock. And there's always a next shock. Look at the 1970s. Oil crises sent food prices spiraling. Inflation became a household word, a daily anxiety. Then the oil stabilized, costs came down, but grocery prices? They eased slightly. They offered promotions, they ran sales, but they never truly reversed. The language changed. Instead of prices are coming down, it became great deals this week. The sale became the new mechanism, not a return to the old baseline, just a temporary dip from the new one. We accepted it because we didn't have a choice. And that's what makes this cycle so durable. It doesn't need a conspiracy. It doesn't need coordination. It just needs everyone involved, producers, distributors, retailers, to independently make the same rational calculation. Holding the higher price is less risky than lowering it and being wrong. Food is different from other goods in a way that matters here. You can delay buying a couch, you can postpone a vacation, you can make a phone last another year, but you cannot delay eating. Demand for food is what economists call inelastic. You need it regardless of price, and when something is non-negotiable, the market knows it. Not in a sinister way, just in a structural way. The floor under food prices is higher than the floor under discretionary purchases because the consequences of undershooting are immediate and severe. So, prices rise fast and fall slow. Asymmetry becomes the rule. The Roman Empire understood this. Grain prices were political, not just economic. When harvests failed, prices spiked. When harvests recovered, prices would ease, but never back to where they started. Emperors intervened with subsidies, price controls, and public grain distribution, not out of generosity, out of necessity, because when people couldn't eat bread, cities burned. The empire didn't fix the price problem, it just managed the political consequences of it. We do the same thing now, we just use different words. Think about where you are right now. Maybe you're watching this in a kitchen where you've started making different decisions. Buying the store brand, skipping the organic section, splitting bulk purchases with a neighbor. Maybe you've already made peace with the new numbers and you're just here because something about this still feels unresolved. Maybe you're somewhere else entirely, financially comfortable but unsettled by the gap between what you're told and what you see. Wherever you are, you've adapted. That's what we do. We adjust our expectations quietly, without fanfare. Because no one announces the moment when a spike becomes a baseline. It just happens in the space between grocery trips, in the silence of acceptance. Here's the part that changes how you see the rest. Prices don't need to collude to move together. They just need to watch each other. When one major brand raises prices and customers keep buying, others notice. When a retailer tests a higher price point and traffic doesn't collapse, the lesson spreads. Not through meetings, not through agreements, just through observation and mimicry. The term for this is price leadership, but that makes it sound intentional. Really, it's just pattern recognition. The market learns what it can get away with, and it remembers. The modern grocery industry is more concentrated than it's ever been. 4 companies control nearly 70% of the beef market. 3 companies process most of the chicken. A handful of corporations own the majority of the brands you think are competing with each other. When there are fewer players, prices don't need to coordinate, they just need to be rational. And rationality in a consolidated market looks a lot like prices that rise quickly and fall slowly. This isn't an indictment, it's a description. Because what matters isn't the morality of individual decisions, it's the structure that makes those decisions inevitable. You don't need villains when the system runs on incentives that all point in the same direction. Executives aren't sitting in boardrooms plotting to keep prices high. They're looking at quarterly reports, supply forecasts, shareholder expectations, and making the choice that keeps their company stable. That choice, multiplied across an entire industry, becomes the pattern you see at the checkout. And once the pattern sets, it's self-reinforcing. Competitors see the higher price hold. Retailers see customers adjust. Suppliers see demand persist. Everyone learns the new floor. The reset happens quietly, in the space where volatility used to mean reversion, but now just means the next plateau. The thing about sales, the weekly specials, the buy one get one offers, the loyalty card discounts, is that they've become the way we experience price relief. Not actual reductions, just temporary deviations from the elevated norm. The sale price today is often what the regular price used to be, but it feels like savings because we're measuring against the new baseline, not the old one. The reference point shifted and we shifted with it. You've probably done this without noticing, felt grateful for a deal that just brings the price back to what it was 18 months ago, felt relieved to find chicken under a certain dollar amount per pound, even though that amount would have seemed outrageous before. That's not a failure of awareness, it's just how adaptation works. We recalibrate. We forget the old anchors because remembering them is exhausting and unproductive. But here's what stays with you: the feeling that something isn't quite right, that the explanations don't match the experience, that inflation slowing should mean something more tangible than it does. You're not wrong to feel that. The dissonance is real. It's the gap between macroeconomic statistics and microeconomic reality, between national averages and your specific cart, between what's technically true and what's practically meaningful. After World War II, similar patterns emerged across Europe and America. Prices surged during wartime rationing and production constraints. When the war ended, everyone expected relief, and there was relief relative to wartime scarcity, but prices didn't return to pre-war levels. The economy had fundamentally repriced itself. Wages had adjusted upward, cost structures had changed, and most importantly, everyone's reference point had shifted. The new prices seemed reasonable because they were lower than the peak, even though they were higher than the past prices. Entire generations lived their whole lives never knowing what their grandparents paid for milk. That's happening now. Children growing up today will have no memory of cheaper eggs, cheaper rent, cheaper basics. This will be their normal. And 20 years from now, when the next shock comes and prices reset higher again, they'll feel the same confusion you're feeling now. The same sense that something is off, the same gap between the official narrative and the lived reality. The cycle doesn't break, it just repeats at higher elevations. Here's the uncomfortable part. The part that sits wrong even as you recognize its truth. This system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as designed. Markets don't exist to be fair. They exist to clear, to find the price where supply meets demand. And right now, that price is higher than it was, and demand hasn't collapsed, so the market has no reason to correct. Fairness isn't part of the equation. It never was. You might be somewhere in your day right now where this is just background noise, something to think about while you're doing something else. Or maybe you've felt this for a while, and you're here because someone finally said it plainly. Either way, you're part of this pattern too. Not as a victim, not as a participant, just as someone living inside a structure that predates you and will outlast you. The grocery store is just where it's most visible. But the same logic runs through rent, through healthcare, through education, through every corner of life where prices climbed and never came back, where the emergency passed but the price stayed, where the market learned a new ceiling and called it a floor. You see it everywhere once you start looking. The temporary that became permanent, the shock that became structure. And the strangest part, the part that makes this so durable, is that no one needs to enforce it. No shadowy cabal keeps prices high. The system just optimizes for stability over fairness, for persistence over reversion, for gradual acceptance over sudden relief. It doesn't need to be defended because it doesn't present itself as a choice. It just becomes the way things are. You adapt because you have to. You budget differently. You shop differently. You complain less because complaining changes nothing. And in that quiet adaptation, the reset completes itself. Not through policy, not through decree, just through the accumulated weight of millions of individual acceptances. The price that seemed outrageous 18 months ago is just the price now, unremarkable, normal. This will happen again. Not next month, maybe not next year, but there will be another shock, another supply chain crisis, another geopolitical disruption, another climate event, another pandemic. Prices will spike, politicians will promise relief, economists will track the rate of change, and when the crisis passes, prices will ease slightly, stabilize, and settle at a new, higher baseline. The pattern will repeat because the incentives haven't changed, the structure hasn't changed, only the altitude. And a new generation will stand in a grocery store aisle, looking at a receipt, feeling the same quiet confusion, wondering why relief never quite feels like relief, why the emergency ended but the consequences didn't, why the number on the shelf seemed permanently wrong. They'll be told the same things you've been told, that inflation is transitory, that supply chains are healing, that prices will stabilize. And all of those things will technically be true. Inflation will slow, supply chains will recover, prices will stabilize, just not where they were before. You're not supposed to see this pattern, not because it's hidden, but because it's too slow. It unfolds across years, across administrations, across news cycles. By the time it completes, we've forgotten where it started. The reference points fade, the outrage becomes fatigue, becomes acceptance, and the price that shocked us yesterday is just the price today. But you see it now. You see why your grocery bill hasn't followed the headlines, why slowing inflation feels like a technicality, why the gap between what you're told and what you experience keeps widening. It's not a mistake, it's not an oversight, it's just the quiet logic of a system that remembers pain longer than it remembers fairness. The groceries are just the most visible example. Look around, the logic is everywhere. In every price that climbed and never came back, in every market that consolidated until it stopped needing to compete, in every shock that became structure. The mechanism changes, the pattern doesn't, and now you won't be able to stop noticing it. The rent that never falls between tenants, the insurance premium that only knows one direction, the streaming service that raises prices every year and calls it an adjustment, the airline ticket that cost more than it did before the fuel crisis ended, the phone plan that climbed during a shortage and stayed there during abundance. It's all the same shape, the same asymmetry, the same quiet recalibration of what's normal, and the same silence when you realize no one's coming to reverse it. Not because they don't care, but because the system isn't designed to reverse. It's designed to adapt, to absorb, to resettle at whatever altitude the market can bear. You bear it because you have to, because eating isn't optional, because living isn't optional, because the alternative to adapting is a confrontation with a structure too large and too diffuse to fight. So you adjust. You make different choices. You find small efficiencies. You normalize the new numbers. And in doing so, you complete the cycle. Not willingly, not happily, just inevitably. That's the part that stays with you. Not that prices are high, but that they'll stay high long after the reasons fade. That relief means slower increases, not reversals. That the emergency will pass, but the aftermath won't. That your children will inherit this altitude as their baseline and wonder why their children complain about the next one. The groceries are just where you see them first, but once you see it there, you see it everywhere. In every corner of the economy where shocks harden into structure, where temporary becomes permanent, where the market learns what you'll tolerate and adjusts accordingly. You can't unsee it now. And maybe that's the point. Not to fix it, not to explain it away, just to see it clearly, to understand that your frustration isn't confusion, it's recognition. The system is working exactly as intended. That's what makes it unsettling. Not that it's broken, but that it isn't.